We are now in the final stages of setting up this guitar. I decided to fret this guitar after finishing, and my thinking was it would simplify the finishing process, and the epoxy I used for pour filling would be easier to clean off of the fingerboard. This worked to an extent, but in the future I'll just tape off the fingerboard. I like to use the Jescar Evo Gold fret wire for all my builds. It's a happy medium between nickel silver and stainless in terms of durability. Since this fingerboard has a binding, I had to cut the fret tangs. This was done during downtime while I was finishing. The frets were hammered, the ends were clipped, and filed down flush to the fingerboard. With a red Sharpie, I marked the tips of all of the frets. This will help us see our progress when it comes time to leveling. Onto leveling, and I've taped some 320 grit sandpaper to the bottom of my leveling beam. Once all of the Sharpie is gone from the tip, I can check that all of the frets are level with my fret rocker. I got this rocker cheap off of eBay, and when it arrived it was anything but flat. So I leveled it on my beam, which I know to be flat. To improve the playability of this guitar, I sanded some ramp off into the upper register of the neck. 3 pieces of tape were placed on the 12th fret, and 1 piece was placed over the sandpaper. I then sanded until I reached roughly the 16th fret. Next up, it's time to round the frets. Tape was placed around the frets to protect the fingerboard, and the tips of the frets were marked again. I like to use a 3-cornered file with ground safe edges to round the frets. There are some files that have the shape of the fret ground in, but I find these not only expensive to buy in every fret size, but also completely useless. With my 3-cornered file, I can shape any type of fret that I want. Once all the frets have been filed to a small point, I then sand the file marks away with 320 to 1500 grit paper. Then, with a buffing attachment for the Dremel and T-cut, I buff the frets up to a high finish. The 2 frets on the left are after buffing, and the 2 on the right are before. I used this fretboard oil from a company called Crimson Guitars. I've never heard of them before, but it seems to do the job. Next up, the tuners can be installed. It's important to make sure the alignment is as straight as possible. Perfect. When drilling the screw holes, a piece of tape was placed on the drill bit to act as a depth stop, so that I don't drill all the way through the headstock. That would not be good. The neck could then be attached to the body. The nut was slightly oversized, so I sanded it down on one face until it was a snug fit behind the fingerboard. The edges were then marked and sanded to size on the bobbin sander. With a halved pencil, I then marked the shape of the nut. It was then cut on the bandsaw and sanded to slightly oversize on the bobbin sander. The slots for the high and low E strings were marked 3.5mm in from the edge of the fingerboard. The lines were squared, and using the Stumac string spacing gauge, I was able to mark the remaining strings. All the slots were cut with a 10 gauge file to make sure all my cuts are straight. Then, with the correct gauge of file, I made all the slots the size they're meant to be. I used my poor man's radal to mark out the location of the bridge, and then drilled out all of the holes with a 3mm bit. With the saddles removed, the string through holes could then be marked out and drilled out on the drill press. I saw this really simple method for drilling out the ferrule holes on the Highline Guitars channel. A snapped piece of drill bit with the same width as the top holes was inlaid into a board, and then positioned right under the center point of the drill press. The drill bit acts as a locator to get the most accurate location of the ferrules. The ferrules are then hammered in. With a standard twist drill bit, I drilled the ground wire channel. I started the drill upright and then slowly angled the drill until I reached the cavity on the other side. The ground wire was then fed through, and the bridge could then be screwed in for the final time. Or not. The slip of the screwdriver left a large dent in the top. It may not be enough to be noticed, but it bothers me. I tried filling the hole with shellac, but I wasn't happy with the finish, so I decided to start over. I sanded all the way back to bare wood, reapplied the stain, and then built up the shellac. While all of this fun was going on, I got to work on the wiring. I began by tinning all the tabs of the pots and switch. The grounds were then made on the back of the pots. I like to use crocodile clips as heat sinks when tinning the capacitor. They're easily fried by the heat. The capacitor is then wired in, as are the live wires to complete the circuit. I followed the wiring diagrams on the Seymour Duncan website. They have great diagrams with a wide variety of combinations. To shield the control cavity in a Faraday cage, I use slug tape. It's a copper conductive tape which grounds the whole cavity. The harness could then be attached to the body, and everything can be bolted down. Now that everything is assembled, we can fine-tune the nut with the files. I didn't take the slots all the way down to final height immediately. Instead, I roughed in the height and came back a few days later to dial everything in. After the string height was set, I filed the top of the nut down until I was happy with the way it looked. I also rounded the corners to make everything feel more comfortable. The nut was then sanded from 120 grit to 1500 grit, and was then polished with T-cut. The last step is to throw some strings on and intonate the instrument. Thanks for watching. I hope to have a demo for this guitar uploaded in the following weeks, along with a full build video for the whole process.